Good afternoon, folks. Here's some more entertaining news from last week at thegamer.com about Mass Effect Andromeda and how they had previous designs for multiple kinds of aliens, but those had to be cut for multiple reasons. And oh boy, what the juicy details bring when we learn about how rushed such a production was, who was involved, why they failed or why they didn't do the things they wanted to, and why they left the company. I think this was the worst crunch we ever saw with BioWare's games, notwithstanding Anthem, if that is still going to be a thing, or what happened with Anthem in the past. So here is the 10 new alien species, but were cut for budget, scope, and cosplay reasons from two people who worked there, one being more of a director, the other one being a writer. All of them there for around 8 to 11 years. So here's what Neil Palner says. I think it was a project that couldn't have possibly lived up to expectations. Not just the high bar of the original trilogy, but the logical expectations anyone would have of Mass Effect going to a whole new galaxy. Because the scope of the first game was so incredibly massive, there was an inherent promise that you'd be getting a massive new experience with a ton of new things from Mass Effect Andromeda. New species, new lore, an entire new galaxy at your fingertips, etc. So Neil was there for, he was a senior writer at BioWare. He started in 2006 at BioWare Austin, was there for 4 years for the Star Wars MMO, The Old Republic, and he was there for Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda for 7 years from 2010 to 2017. So, long time writer. A lot of effort was put in. But the idea of making a next game, which is a spiritual successor or an offshoot or whatever you want to call Andromeda, to be comparable is you have to do something original, meaning something new, but you also have to make it likable. What made the first one a proper Mass Effect experience? What is the Mass Effect experience? What does that involve? You have to nail those things down. And this is why I talk about doing something new or unexpected. Spinning the chair around for the audience. Go, oh my God! What? I never was expecting that to come. So you have to have a certain ratio between what's expected and what's new. Whether it's 50-50 or 60-40, it doesn't really matter what your ratio is. You have to know what is Mass Effect and what is Mass Effect Andromeda. How do you blend those two ideas together? And in case you haven't heard from the previous article from Jason Schreier on Kotaku, at the time when he was at Kotaku, in his long article, out of this 5 years, which is 60 months, 18 of those months, so 30% of the time, which was the last 30% of the project, was where the bulk of Andromeda's work went. And that's because of all the various things they had to do. For example, the procedurally generated planets, the animations, the story. All of these things were not figured out. They couldn't do the procedurally generated planets. It was too complicated, so they scrapped it. The animation, they didn't do a very good job with that, so they scrapped all the stuff they wanted to do. Story was still up in the air, and that was after more than 2.5 to 3 years. They weren't sure what was going on. That is not a good sign for making a project, at least a video game project. But we were only given the budget for 2 new species plus the remnant. Now, I don't know how that works, because when you're making a Mass Effect game, you expect some of the aliens to come back, like the Asari, the Quarians, the Turians, etc. And you could still have individual characters representing those species, but then have your whole cavalcade, your whole repertoire of aliens, new aliens. So there was nothing stopping a designer from going, hey, we should do this. The problem is there was no time. So that someone couldn't say, oh, we got to do this from scratch, because they already had stuff worked. It was just bad. It was poorly planned out crap. So a very weak foundation to work with. If you have a very weak foundation for a setting and characters and aliens and whatever and planets and a science fiction world, where are you going to put your story? What is your protagonist going to do? What is their conflict going to be? It's very difficult to do this because you have to physically build the world. And if nothing is written down in theory, like a story, on paper, then you don't know what you're doing. Not to mention that we couldn't even include the Milky Way, all the Milky Way species. We weren't able to let you travel throughout the galaxy. This meant that we had to develop the story around some pretty glaring inorganic limitations. So not only did you get something that felt and was much smaller than what you got before, almost everyone playing the game probably had something that they really liked about Mass Effect that just wasn't there. And this depends on what you consider your Mass Effect or gaming experience to be in the first, second, and third games. Was it the interaction with characters? That's always a big thing in BioWare games. That would be number one for me. The dialogue wheel would be part of that. The combat, sure, that takes a second seat to the dialogue wheel, but still, it has to be part of it. So what do? You can just take 90% of what you know from Mass Effect and polish up the combat. That would have worked. In fact, that's what they kind of did. They took the combat itself from Mass Effect and did new things. They had all these weapons and mods and classes, and the class restriction was thrown out the door. You could do all kinds of crazy things. So you could say that the combat and the gameplay was improved, or at least focused on. But the actual story and characters and the reason why you play a BioWare game or a Mass Effect game is the dialogue wheel, to have those social interactions. That was not done well. In fact, it was thrown away. And you had this thing that was like the dialogue wheel. It represented, at least visually, the dialogue wheel, but it wasn't in fact a Mass Effect dialogue experience. Ryder the Explorer should have a challenging and dynamic first contact experience. Instead, you're almost immediately killing Ket, so some very basic pillars just weren't lining up. So when you're talking about having conflict in your story, and all of a sudden you come across an alien species, first contact scenario, which is what you wanted in Andromeda to happen multiple times because you're a human going to another galaxy, and you're encountering aliens from another galaxy. That makes sense. It immediately turns violent, which is fine, but then that's all it is. There's another first contact scenario, but that's all it comes down to. Just a bunch of military shenanigans where you're just killing Ket every conflict. It's like, oh, go to another planet, conflict with the Ket. The other BioWare Montreal writers and I were dreaming up and developing things for Andromeda months ahead of Edmonton officially starting the project, i.e. before the budget and scope had been decided or communicated. So this is not a good thing. It's great to have brainstorming ideas story-wise. Like, who are your characters? You can make some basic preliminary understandings. You're going to have a character. You're going to have some supporting characters. But you can keep it nice and tight and simple. What's the general idea of the game? And you can say, okay, we can't have 6 characters. We only have 4. Or whatever the limitation will be imposed on later. You can make some brainstorms. You can make some imaginative guesses about what's going to be happening. We just knew that we were going to Andromeda with almost nothing else established, including even when in the timeline would happen, and we set out to brainstorm and grow ideas that could organically serve that general premise. This is good. You have a premise of going to a new galaxy. What might that involve? Who are the characters involved? Why would they be doing that? You have an N7. You have this or that. Great. No problem. That first contact expedition I mentioned, we developed ideas for how the player would navigate that. We were working on a process for the Milky Way species to learn and how to even communicate with a new alien species. We were developing several additional species for the new galaxy, as well as several different storylines for why the expedition had been undertaken. Most of that pre-development work ended up not being used. So they had all this story set up for why things are happening, as opposed to just a bunch of videos we got for marketing promotion of why you're going on this voyage, which was just, it's exciting, it's adventurous, it's new. That's it. It's a pioneer work. It's like, yeah, that's it? Because you can? Not a very good excuse when you already have an attractive galaxy that the majority of which has not been explored in a general sense in Mass Effect. Here's Chris Hepler, expands the new alien species. Oh boy, there's our good old Chris. I proposed 5 or 6 new alien species when Andromeda was in its infancy, and I still think they had a ton of potential. And Joe Barry also came up with a few too, and they were awesome. So here we have, the lore master, Chris Hepler, talking about another writer who had some other great ideas, and they were scrapped. However, I'm pretty sure those ideas are still property of BioWare, so even though I'm 100% certain they won't be used, I can't talk about them without getting some kind of permission. So he's still under an NDA. So on top of the 10 that this article is talking about, we had 5 or 6 at least from Hepler that no one knows anything about. I remember some early concepts that were pretty out there. This is Dorian Kieken. So Dorian Kieken, he was at BioWare for 8 years, and he was a producer back in 2007 for all kinds of games. Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 3, Mass Effect 2 DLCs, and Mass Effect Andromeda. He was the project development director for 3 years. So this is one of the guys that didn't know what the hell was going on, or didn't do a very good job of being a project development director before Mac Walters took over, believe it or not. So I have to give Mac Walters some credit here and there. I know I bash him a lot, but it wasn't until Mac Walters came on board that he had a drastic take to salvage what was Mass Effect Andromeda as we know it. So it wasn't really until Mac Walters came on board, and that was very much a reaction to the state of the critical path. He was really brought on board to give it direction and get it into shape. Before that, it was quite rudderless. So, Dorian, I don't know what you were doing for 3 years and 8 months, but things weren't working. He was the director at BioWare Montreal for Mass Effect 2 and 3 before being promoted to franchise design director at the beginning of Andromeda's development. One of the strengths of the original trilogy is that you can actually cosplay most of the alien characters, except the Hanar. The intention is Mass Effect Andromeda was to introduce new races that would still be in the realm of cosplay, which is probably why more crazy concepts were abandoned. Okay, I guess BioWare is going for, we want people to dress up at conventions and Halloween and N7 Day for some strange reason. Why though? What's the point? Why is this a selling point for making a game? Do they want to make merchandise? Do they want to make paraphernalia that people can buy and like makeup and stuff like that? Like do they want to sell crap outside of the game for this extremely niche audience of cosplayers? I mean, okay, but why don't you just make a good game with a good story first and then go, okay, some of our aliens need to be cosplayed, or some of our characters should be aliens which can be cosplayed. That would be a little more a secondary or tertiary or nth degree consideration for when you design something. In the early development of the game, we explored a lot of new species. I'm not sure why we settled on the specific number that were in the final game, aside from budget and time restrictions that we were just explained to. But my guess would be a mix of production reasons and having a reasonable amount of races to deal with, knowing we were already bringing quite a few from the Milky Way as well. And this is what I'd understand. If you just wanted to have your races represented from the Milky Way and then have your 10 or 8 or whatever in Andromeda, just have the one Quarian squad mate or the one Quarian crewmate. The same with the one Asari. And they kind of did that in certain ways. But that would have been a basic solution. Just have the representative of the Quarians. Boom, there they are. That would be fine. You don't need 30 Quarians running around. Or all these stories. I think it's more story related than setting related. Andromeda has strong core gameplay that improved a lot over the trilogy, but the story didn't feel as strong. I didn't connect with the new character cast as I did with the original trilogy. And this is where you see the problem. The dev team can focus on gameplay like crazy because they don't need to worry about a story. They don't need to worry about what this character can do. The character of Ryder just can do anything. He can manufacture anything. He can mod anything. And it becomes this crazy mishmash of abilities and skills and weapons, which is great for gameplay, but doesn't say much about Ryder as a character. It's also not a fair comparison as the trilogy is 3 games, so you have a lot more exposition and time to bond with the characters. That's fine, but your design was for one game, which would hopefully be able to be made into future games. If without a solid foundation, you can't do that. That being said, I seem to recall a stronger roller coaster of emotions in the original trilogy, which I think led to more memorable moments, from the tension of almost blowing up Rex, I remember that, or gathering everyone on a suicide run, to the lightness of listening to Morton sing, or shooting cans with Garrus in the Presidium. And these are mostly just character moments, or doing something with characters, conflict with characters, memorable scenes with characters, the character definitions or expositions with Morton singing, determining what kind of character he is. This is what BioWare games are known for. Characters. Interesting, compelling, dramatic, tragic characters. This is what you need. And you don't have that in Andromeda. You have characters, but they're not that cool. They're not that interesting. And some of them are downright boring, if not useless. I think the thesis statement as for why is that the Mass Effect trilogy was an incredibly demanding endeavor. The checks that were written for it, the complexity of the experience was insanely massive. The team worked their asses for nonstop for so many years on back-to-back-to-back games. Well, guess what? You had 5 years for Andromeda. What was the problem? What was stopping you? Now, we know what was the problem was the various ideas like procedural generated planets, which were a thing that weren't proven yet. And they were trying to do that in an engine like Frostbite that no one had experience in or was well versed in. So you had the wrong tech to do the wrong futuristic new concept, which didn't work. So there's a lot of tech ideas that weren't sold off on when they could have easily have just told basic stories in basic planets, static planets that weren't generated on the fly. The prospect of doing the same thing again was not only exhausting to imagine, but totally impractical, compared to the worst crunch you ever had making Andromeda in 18 months. Some of the lessons learned from the original trilogy are ones that are important for game development, but result in the player experience being less. When you're talking about AAA development, the original trilogy is actually the anomaly, not Andromeda. You could argue that the original trilogy was an anomaly. At the same time, you're BioWare. You pulled it off. You know what to do and what not to do, so the next time you do it, you know what to expect, you know what methodology to use, you know what efficiencies to employ and not employ, so that you actually get the job done. You plan it out. It doesn't mean you're going to be perfect 100% with the plan, and I'm sure you're going to be behind by a year, but you plan everything out. You get the story locked in. You get the characters locked in. You get the plot beats locked in, and then you build everything. That's how it goes. Because I moved on from BioWare after my work on Andromeda was complete, I have no idea what, if any, future plans there might be. At the time of my departure, there were none. I find the game to be actually pretty darn fun, and once the technical flaws were ironed out and the initial reactive disappointment faded, the game does stand on its own. There's some really good stuff in there. Yeah, in terms of gameplay, you could make that argument, but not in terms of story. When you have only a year and a half to do a project that is being controlled or seen by Mac Walters, man, I'm surprised this thing even got released, but there you go. Cosplay, only having 18 months, a bunch of writers' ideas never being seen the light of day, and that's how you get a really weak basis for an offshoot of one of their most popular franchises from BioWare. Thanks for listening, folks. Have yourself a great day.